So how on earth can something be legally classified as having no accepted medical use, while at the same time, the FDA is calling it a breakthrough therapy? I mean, that just doesn't add up, right? Well, that is the central mystery of psilocybin, the active compound in so-called magic mushrooms. Okay, let's get into it. Let's really dive into the science behind this incredible contradiction.
Right here, this is the moment that really changed the game. Back in 2018, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, looked at the early research and gave psilocybin this special status for treatment-resistant depression, and they later added major depressive disorder to that. Now, this is not some minor thing. It means the data is suggesting a significant improvement over the therapies we already have.
And this slide, it just lays the whole conflict bare, doesn't it? On one side, you've got its status as a Schedule I drug, which it's been since 1971. That's the category for things with a high potential for abuse and supposedly no medical value. But then on the other side, you have this breakthrough therapy label, which, is reserved for the absolute most promising new treatments out there. So, what gives? What did scientists see that the law is completely missing? Well, the answer, it turns out, doesn't start with the drug. It starts with the brain.
To really get the solution, we've got to understand the problem first. And there's a huge body of research now that suggests for a lot of people with depression and anxiety, the problem is kind of like a fire inside the brain.
For the longest time, we were kind of stuck in this idea that what happens in your mind is totally separate from what happens in your body. But we now know that's just wrong. There's this whole field called psychoneuroimmunology, which is really just a long word for how your mind, your nervous system, and your immune system are all talking to each other. And we've learned they're in constant conversation. What happens in the mind happens in the body, period.
So how does that conversation actually work? Well, it often kicks off with chronic stress. And I'm not just talking about a bad day at the office, but that prolonged, grinding pressure. This kind of stress puts your immune system on high alert. It starts pumping out these tiny protein messengers called pro-inflammatory cytokines. You can think of them as little alarm bells. And when enough of those alarms travel through your blood and get into your brain, they can trigger what's called neuroinflammation. It's a fancy term, but it just means inflammation inside your brain. And listen, this isn't just some abstract theory. When scientists actually look at patients with depression and anxiety, they consistently find higher levels of these specific inflammatory markers. These are the biological smoke signals for that fire in the brain. The connection is so strong that inflammation is now seen as a really critical piece of the puzzle for a lot of mental illnesses.
This visual right here, it just brings it all together so well. Stress and trauma can kick off inflammation, which then becomes this common root that connects things like mental illness, autoimmune disorders, and other chronic diseases. It's a really powerful, unifying way to think about modern illness. So if inflammation is the problem, what if we had a tool that could actually put out the fire?
And that, of course, brings us right back to psilocybin. Because what the research is showing is that it's not some blunt instrument. It's actually more like a sophisticated multi-tool that seems almost perfectly designed to tackle the very problems we just talked about.
Okay, I know this diagram looks a little complicated, but the main idea is actually pretty simple. When you take psilocybin, your body converts it into its active form, which is called psilocin. And psilocin is like a key that fits perfectly into a specific lock in your brain, a receptor called 5-HT2A. Turning that one key is like flipping a master switch that sets off a whole cascade of amazing effects, which we can basically break down into 3 key tools.
The first tool, and maybe the most important one, is a fire extinguisher. When that 5-HT2A receptor gets activated, it has this profound anti-inflammatory effect. It directly shuts down the activity of those exact same cytokines we saw before, like TNF-alpha and IL-6, that are so high in people with depression. It literally quiets the fire.
All right, tool number 2, it's like a construction worker for your brain. See, chronic stress and depression can really wear down your neural pathways, making your brain kind of rigid. Psilocybin boosts a protein called BDNF, which is basically miracle grow for your neurons. It helps the brain become more flexible, more plastic, and that allows it to build new connections and break out of those old, stuck, negative patterns.
And finally, the third tool is like a volume knob. We all have this brain network called the default mode network, the DMN. It's the part that's active when we're thinking about ourselves, chewing on the past, worrying about the future. In depression, this network can be way overactive, just trapping people in these endless loops of negative thought. What psilocybin does is it turns the volume down on the DMN, giving people a break from that relentless inner critic. So, okay, we've got this powerful biological multi-tool. The big question then becomes, how do you actually use it? And right now, there are two very, very different approaches being explored. So on one side, you've got macrodosing. We're talking a high, hallucinogenic dose that's taken pretty infrequently and always in a controlled therapeutic setting. The whole goal is to have this profound psychological experience, a journey that can kind of reset your whole perspective. And then on the other side, you've got microdosing, taking these tiny, subperceptual doses on a regular basis for more of a subtle, ongoing support. Now, this is a really crucial point. That breakthrough therapy status from the FDA, that is based entirely on the evidence from macrodosing. The data we have from these therapist-guided high-dose clinical trials is really strong and consistent. It's showing rapid and lasting benefits for people with really severe depression and anxiety. But what about microdosing? Well, even though it's gotten incredibly popular, the scientific evidence is a lot murkier. It's a totally different story from the macrodose studies. Just take a look at this. It's a real mixed bag. You've got some studies, often based on what people report themselves, where they say, yeah, I feel better, my mood's improved, I'm less stressed. But then you get to the really rigorous placebo-controlled trials, the gold standard, right? And when you look at those, like the Marshall and Cavanagh studies, the benefits kind of just vanish. The scientific community just isn't sure yet if it actually works any better than a placebo. But despite that mixed evidence for microdosing, public interest is just exploding. A 2024 study from the RAND Corporation estimated that 8 million Americans used psilocybin in the last year alone. And get this, nearly half of them were microdosing. This really shows you this massive public interest that is running way ahead of the science and the law.
You know, all of this research, it's not just about treating depression, it's actually forcing us to zoom out and think about a whole new way of understanding the deep connection between our minds and our bodies. Remember this inflammation pathway diagram? Let's just add one more really important layer to it. We now know that adverse childhood experiences, things like abuse or neglect, can literally program a person's immune system for a lifetime of chronic inflammation. It sets the stage for all those interconnected problems we saw: mental illness, autoimmunity, chronic disease, the whole shebang.
So if psilocybin is this potent anti-inflammatory that also helps rewire the brain, well then its potential could go way beyond depression. Researchers are now seriously asking if it could help with other conditions that are also rooted in inflammation and trauma. Things like PTSD, certain autoimmune disorders, anorexia, and maybe even neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. And it's not just speculation. Researchers like Thompson and Sabo are exploring this exact idea. As they put it, psychedelics might be able to resolve autoimmunity by getting at the root causes, that chronic stress and inflammation that drives so many different diseases. It's a total shift in how we think about this stuff. And that brings us all the way back to our central mystery. The reason a Schedule I drug is also a breakthrough therapy is because we're finally starting to understand the science. This isn't about magic or mysticism anymore. It's about a specific compound that acts as a targeted biological tool to fight inflammation, rebuild connections, and quiet the noise in our brains. Which leaves us with a really fascinating final thought. The story of psilocybin is, in many ways, the story of inflammation. And if inflammation really is this common thread that ties our mental health to so many chronic physical diseases, well, what does the future of medicine even look like when we start focusing on putting out that fire?